Hello, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Hi, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook. Today, I'm really excited for our guest, Rachel Brombaugh. She's the Washington State Managing Director for PACE Equity, which provides funding for resource efficiency and resiliency improvements for retrofits and new construction in the commercial built environment here in Washington State. Prior to joining PACE Equity, Rachel served as the Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives for King County Executive Dow Constantine. And there she developed policy programs and partnerships to achieve a low carbon future. And during her tenure there, she led the development and operations of King County's PACE program. So I'm really excited to talk to Rachel today. She and I had a great conversation before we started recording about her work. I find it really fascinating because I don't sit in the finance world, but it's a great intersection between finance and climate change and sustainability and carbon. And I'm just really excited to share Rachel with the listeners and hear her story. So welcome, Rachel. Glad you're here.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to dig right into questions. So like I mentioned, PACE is a form of public-private partnership. And that's a pretty unique type of security that, as you have explained to me previously, it stays with the property because you're financing the components of the property that conserve water and energy and reduce carbon. But can you break that down a little bit more for me and other listeners who might not be living in that banking and financing space every day? Kind of what does that mean and what is the work that PACE does?
Great. Yeah, it is complex. PACE, which is the acronym for Property Assessed Clean Energy, is similar to a voluntary property tax. So here in Seattle, where I live, voters see proposals to levy a supplemental property tax to support affordable housing or to improve school facilities. If the vote passes, the city will raise the capital, build the project, and residents will pay the levy for however many years, just like they pay property taxes. With PACE, the private property owner does something similar. He or she engages with a private capital provider like PACE Equity to fund a project. Because the components of the project that are financed are beneficial to the community, for example, they reduce carbon pollution or use less resources or increase the safety of buildings, the public partner, the county, allows the assessment to be recorded on the property very similar to a property tax. This provides a high level of security or assurance in non-banking terms to PACE Equity. So in turn, we're able to offer funding at very long amortization, fixed rate, non-recourse terms. So it's a win for the developer or owner who has a lower cost to build the project and a win for the community who has a better built environment and cleaner air.
That's awesome. That's as I sit here in my legal world and I think about all the mechanisms from like a regulatory perspective, right, that I live in most days. It sounds just so creative and innovative to be thinking about incentives that are not regulatory but financial to kind of solve some of the the problems that are really like top of mind and present for so many of us. So I still have a lot to learn in that regard as to how it all works, but it's really interesting to me. And speaking of interesting, you have a really interesting background. You and I got to talk about that a little bit before your interview. And I really loved how you talked about, you worked really hard at achieving this set of hard skills, right? So specific degrees that you could use then to implement your values through your work. Can you tell us a little bit more about your pathway to your current role? And then also how you kind of are using your professional work, your day in and day out professional activity to leverage your personal values around climate change?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I care really deeply about the natural environment we live in and the health of inhabitants in our environment. So humans, trees, animals, fish, bees, plants. I think I probably am categorized as a tree hugger. I believe we have a responsibility to live in a way that enables future generations to live comfortably too. And we have those technologies. All we need is the will or the right incentives, right, that are aligned. So with some luck, some privilege definitely, and a lot of hard work, I've been able to make a career that aligns, my work with those personal values. So after I graduated from college, I moved to Seattle and I started working for some startup tech firms on the operations side. Pretty quickly, I realized I didn't have the business skills I needed. So I applied and thankfully was accepted to the MBA program at the Foster School of Business here at the University of Washington. At Foster, I focused on finance and economics. And when I graduated, I was recruited to work for a national commercial bank. And it was a great experience and foundation for my career. I sold all sorts of financial products, loans, lines of credit, cash management services, all that kind of things. So I did that for a couple of years. Then I took some time out of the workforce to stay at home with my daughter. When I came back, I worked for a community development financial institution called Craft 3. And this is a non-bank lender. And all the loans have to have a positive economic, social, or environmental benefit. These were riskier loans and harder to underwrite, but really rewarding. So during this time, then Seattle Mayor Greg Nichols stood up his Green Ribbon Commission on Climate Protection. And Mayor Nichols wanted to know how was Seattle going to comply with the Kyoto Protocol. And so he was gathering building owners and business leaders, banks, lenders, and policymakers together. I volunteered to represent my company, and that's where I really started meeting people who were active in climate and energy at the time and learning about the levers to pull to make a more sustainable community. After a couple years at Craft 3, I had the opportunity to join the finance team at McKinstry, a construction and energy services company headquartered here in Seattle. The country was deep in the recession caused by the 2008 stock market crash. The manufacturing sector was bleeding jobs, and the financial markets were frozen. I started out securing financing for projects for McKinstry to then build. And then a couple years later, I pivoted when the financial markets opened up again. I pivoted to working with the sales teams to develop tools and messaging for what I call the financial sell. So speaking in financial language to the CFO or director of finance so that he or she could be confident that this efficiency project was a good investment, right? It was clearly a good move for the entity to make their building more efficient, but we also want to make sure that it was a good use of their funding. So I was also working on policy throughout McKinstry's energy services footprint in 15 states, looking to advance efficiency and things like that. Then one day in 2016, a friend forwarded me a job opportunity at King County, leading policy and developing relationships with businesses and other stakeholders to advance energy efficiency and renewable energy in the region. I could leverage my business background to influence policy and develop those programs. So after a couple of years, I moved into a leadership role to lead a broad suite of initiatives to reduce carbon, lead with climate justice, and prepare for the impacts of climate change. And as you mentioned, one of the projects I led was the establishment of King County's PACE program. So when setting up the program, I met financiers and lots of other folks in the industry, and I really liked that linkage between the economic incentives, a lower cost of capital, and the climate outcomes, efficient, low carbon buildings. And I thought this would be a really good step in my career. So late in 22, I joined Pace Equity, one of the financiers. And I joined Pace Equity first because of the people. Leadership is transparent, passionate, and ethical. And because Pace Equity is the only company really driving change in the built environment with our Cirrus low carbon product. It's the same PACE mechanism, but through Cirrus, Pace Equity can offer a lower cost of capital for buildings that meet our low carbon specification that we designed with the New Buildings Institute, an independent nonprofit working to improve the energy efficiency in commercial buildings. So Cirrus certification is similar to LEED in many ways, but focuses more heavily on carbon reduction, while LEED focuses on a broader suite of components in the built environment. So if a developer is looking at LEED certification for a project, that building is an excellent candidate for Cirrus. But in short, I've come full circle back to banking, and I'm just thrilled to be able to work on projects that have a positive impact on the climate.
I love the concept of like the educational tools that you pursued to really give you this skill set to build your career in a way that feels, I'm assuming, professionally satisfying, but also personally gratifying as well. And I think it's interesting. I was just getting on a plane the other day and chatting with someone as we were waiting in line. And he asked what kind of line of work I was in. And I said, I do environmental and energy regulatory law. And he said, I'm an engineer in the biosciences, but my passion is climate change. I'm trying to apply my engineering degree to figure out what I can do to make a difference. He was like, he has grandkids already. And he's like, I need to leave some sort of legacy so that my kids and grandkids know that I tried to do something to make a difference, to really have an impact. And it was pretty cool to listen to him talk about kind of pivoting his engineering skills to see what he could do. So it's great to hear about professionals in this line of work really kind of focusing, and that there's kind of this groundswell of people dedicated to the kind of work that you do. If I were to look around Seattle or kind of the Pacific Northwest, Puget Sound area, would I see all sorts of buildings that you've worked on and financed in terms of new buildings or retrofits?
Well, not yet. PACE is fairly new in Washington state. The legislature enabled it in 2020. And the first programs, it takes a while to set up these programs. I'll just speak at King County. We did a lot of outreach to the development community to make sure we were building a program that would work. So the first programs got set up early in 2022. A lot of programs in different counties are just coming online now. So it's a huge opportunity for growth. I think especially with all the development going on, especially in multifamily, but also with Clean Buildings Act compliance that buildings will need to do.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the Clean Buildings Act? I know that's a little off the cuff, but I know it's been kind of top of mind here at K&L Gates and some of the work that the attorneys are doing.
Yeah, so the Clean Buildings Act, I can't remember exactly what year that passed. I should know that, 2021 maybe, requires all buildings over 20,000 square feet to comply with certain energy intensity targets, so certain efficiency targets depending on the type of the building. Right now, the compliance hasn't started yet. It starts in 2026 for the biggest buildings over 200,000 square feet. So right now, there's a program that Commerce is offering to incentives for early action. So what building owners will need to do is audit their building, go through, look at it, have a firm like McKinstry or another energy services or engineering firm come out, run an audit on their building, see how it's performing, and then compare it to the standards that the state has established. And then very, very likely they'll need to make changes and improvements to their building to make it more efficient, whether it's on the mechanical side or the electrical side. The good thing about this is that yes, it will reduce carbon. It will be more efficient. However, a more efficient building also saves the building owner or operator money. When you spend less on electricity, you spend less on electricity, and that can be a real benefit to the building owners too.
Yeah, interesting. I'm smiling a little bit because my electrical bill with all my Christmas lights this year was really high. I'm going to have to do something different, I think, next year.
Well, power prices are going up, and they continue to go up. And I'm not criticizing the utilities. It's a dynamic market, and I think it's a really smart investment for a building owner to make their building as efficient as possible, so that they can weather whether they're price shocks or just price increases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I live in a very small home, and I don't go crazy with Christmas lights, but was kind of comparing that with some friends, like, "Whoa, was your bill really high?" Because I was pretty surprised, and across the board, everyone said yes, whether they had lights or not. So everyone's feeling that for sure. So, what does a typical week look like for you? Who are you talking to? Who are you partnering with? Who are some of the thought leaders that you're engaging with in these conversations?
Great. What I love about my job is the balance and the two sides of the balance. So I spend a lot of time, more than half my time, talking to people. I talk to commercial developers and building owners and other really important folks in the commercial real estate industry. So architects and contractors and engineers and consultants. I talk to policymakers and sustainability and economic development staff and local government and climate advocacy organizations who want to see a better built environment. I have a lot of phone calls, coffee chats, even though I don't actually drink coffee, and lunches. and so I'm working to build trust and educate the industry on the benefits of PACE equity products and processes, right? So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, PACE is pretty new in Washington State. It's new in a lot of the counties that have enabled it. And so there's a lot of folks that just don't know about it. So I'm out there working to really increase the awareness. When I'm not out talking to people, I'm working on financial models and figuring out how I can meet a customer's goals with funding from PACE Equity for my company. So, running some models, sharpening the pencil. I'm always I'm always reading and learning. what are regional, national, global climate trends? What are some new technologies? What are new directions in sustainability and resiliency increasingly needed? What's going on in the market? How do I understand that and be able to speak to folks in there? So
Do you have any particular publications that you would recommend or specific podcasts or websites that you kind of regularly visit? That's part of my professional daily life too, is what am I going to pay attention to today that I can learn a little something new even amidst all the other work that I'm doing?
yeah, there's some great resources here. The Puget Sound Business Journal is a fantastic publication. It's broader than just commercial real estate. It's very focused on the overall regional economy. NAOP is also, it's more real estate focused. That's a great organization. I also I've been going to some crew events lately. It's not a publication, but it's women in commercial real estate, and that's been a really great place to meet folks and learn more about the industry.
Yeah, it's great to have those resources. And also I love hearing that you're kind of getting out into the community more, like as we are emerging from COVID and being able to actually be social creatures again. It's really nice to be in spaces with each other and people that are like-minded and kind of learn and evolve together. So it's awesome to hear you getting out.
Yeah, and I've found that talking to folks, we are so lucky here in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, first of all, we have such a depth of expertise in climate thought leadership. Some of my long-time collaborators are Climate Solutions, Northwest Energy Efficiency Council, Northwest Energy Coalitions, and these are not-for-profits with really broad-based support of both advocacy and business organizations that are really thinking about how can we be a thriving low carbon society here in the Pacific Northwest. And then as I've been out meeting more and more developers, I'm just blown away with some of the work that developers and architects in our region are doing as they lead on sustainable design. Just some really amazing technologies and just really beautiful buildings that are really pushing the envelope on some of the work too that we don't see in other parts of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear. That's spent some time traveling a bit this fall for work. And I remember being struck in a particular city that there was no recycling program, and for me, we just recycle so religiously and like compost all of our food and it gets hauled away. And, I'm sure there's so much more work we could be doing, but we're supported by an infrastructure that allows us as individual citizens to participate in that. And I think many of us don't even think about the buildings we're in and how that could change and how that could help not only with reducing carbon and efficiency, but also kind of our climate resiliency and thinking through that. So that's a great reminder that we are lucky to live where we live, for sure, even when the days are gray, day after day. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned through your work, either on a personal basis or professional, in the broader context of energy efficiency and carbon reduction? What do you want to talk about that you've learned from the work that you do?
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it just a second ago. Most of the people that I have worked with and talked to over the years, they believe in climate change. They're seeing and experiencing it, but they don't know what to do that will make a difference. And right, we're told to recycle, consume less, drive an electric car, or take transit, or walk, electrify our buildings, fly less, eat a plant-based diet. Lots of stuff. It's all good stuff, but it can be really overwhelming and honestly not that effective if we don't have the policy and infrastructure to support those personal choices. Just like you wanted to recycle, but there was no recycling program, right? So the clearest nexus of this, though, is in the housing sector. So a couple of years ago, the city of Shoreline ran a study on the carbon footprint of different household structures. And the transit adjacent apartment family had a minimal carbon footprint compared to the suburban drive focused single family house type family. But right now, our housing availability and affordability crisis makes the low carbon choice impossible. For example, someone may want to live in a transit-oriented neighborhood in Seattle and walk or take transit, but they can't find an apartment that fits the family for under $3,500 a month. That's a lot, right? So let's look into the math, right? So if you follow the 30% rule, which is no more than 30% of your income should be spent on housing, a household needs to make about $140,000 a year to afford that $3,500 a month apartment. Seattle area media income in 2022 was $120,000. So we've already cut out over half of the population that can live in a place like that. And just for reference, US median household income was $70,000. That's in 2021 numbers. But so we're talking about, a really steep curve and a real cost issue in our region. So what happens is the family moves out and out and out and out from the city until they can find a place that they can afford. And now it's no longer in the dense urban core and they have to drive to work or wherever they need to go because it's not well served by transit because it's not in a dense population hub. Another thing is that it's going to be what I call a long ground game, especially in our existing building stock. We have building codes that for new construction that are resulting in really efficient new buildings, both commercial and residential. But we need to tackle buildings that we have now, right? Our existing office buildings, our homes, etc. And I'll just kind of share a story about how change can be really hard, even if you're motivated. So a couple years ago, my husband and I got rid of natural gas, methane in our home and had an electric heat pump installed for our heat and hot water needs and switched to an induction stove. And so despite me thinking that I know what I'm doing, I'm a climate professional, so I know about the technologies and being really motivated as a climate advocate and see honestly having the ability to afford this project, it still took over a year to get done. Some real big hurdles, right? You have contractors coming out to look at your house and place bids. You got to figure out the financing. You have workers all over your house installing things and making a mess. You got to deal with the gas company. And in my case, I had to convince my husband that this really was the right thing to do. It wasn't cheap, right? So if it took me a year of really motivated action, think how hard it will be for someone who doesn't have the time to navigate this maze or have the resources. It needs to be easier to do the right thing. And, just last, even though it is really hard to know what to do, when I was leading programs at King County and working with residents, I always told them that their voice was one of the most powerful tools. So here in Washington State and Puget Sound, we're fortunate to have leadership that is making good policy on climate. We're addressing electricity generation supplies, carbon emissions from businesses and buildings with the Clean Building Act, developing high-speed rail and transit, and slowly but surely, I'm being optimistic, seeing that crucial link between housing affordability and climate.
Yeah, that's quite a roller coaster to kind of think through the long ground game. And I like that you had a personal story there too. I mean, that's even, I live in West Seattle. And so when the bridge was declared undrivable, it forced a different kind of commuting, which, I rode my bike, I took the water taxi. It was challenging at times, and we definitely kind of got stuck there more than we wanted to. But, it was an incentive to kind of rethink how we were going to do things. And remote work obviously helped with that a lot. But now the bridge is back in place, and it only takes me like 12 minutes to get to work instead of 45. And so some days I just decide to drive because it's easier to do and, more efficient from a time perspective. But I'm trying to figure out how can we forge that balance. And it's just one small thing, right? It's just one person doing a commute. But when the right incentives or disincentives are in place, I think it can really change behavior.
Exactly.
But I do commend you for taking on that house project. I have not been so courageous so far.
That could be a whole nother podcast.
Right. Oh, I bet. So what's been the most surprising or thrilling aspect of your work?
It's always exciting to be part of something tangible and positive. So I love being part of a project, whether it's a program delivering heat pumps to low-income households or developing a wind farm or financing part of a beautiful, efficient building, and just knowing you are part of the team that made it happen.
Was a part of a project in Texas, a wind facility in Texas, and the developer went above and beyond their conservation and mitigation requirements to preserve some tall grass prairie that was the only specific prairie left in that area. And I was just so proud to help that client, just see their press release and see the beautiful pictures of the prairie. And it felt really good, especially sometimes when you're in the day-to-day, in your office on a computer screen. It's nice to see real things happening in the world. So,
and it's good to celebrate those. I think that's something that, in years before I would finish a project and just move right on to the next one. But it's good to stop and celebrate and be like, that was great. We preserved some prairie, or we put up this building that's, net zero. I mean, it's good to celebrate and be happy about the successes.
In the financing world, which is your world, what do you think people will be talking about when it comes to climate change, carbon reduction, building efficiency, kind of in the next 3 to 5 years? I feel like you're very much on the cutting edge right now with what you're doing. Can you kind of peek around the corner and give us a little bit more of an outlook there?
As you know, things are pretty dynamic right now. Especially in the Puget Sound, the commercial office market is in a state of flux where hybrid remote work seems to be the way of the future, and we're seeing firms downsize their footprints substantially. I was actually at an event last week where one of the panelists said we need to think of a new name for what the office will be because in the future, because it might be so different from what we think of an office now. And I think we'll see a shift to more collaborative spaces, maybe more mixed use with more amenities. Kind of hard to tell at this point. But to be competitive, existing office buildings will need to upgrade. And that's always an opportunity to revisit the performance of the building. I talked about before, the Clean Buildings Act will help drive some of that too. But thinking more broadly, what I hope we see in 3 to 5 years are financial mechanisms to incent the reduction in embodied carbon. So when we talk about efficiency now, especially in the PACE world, we're talking about operational carbon. What is the energy used to turn on the lights, the heat, etc., in the building? Embodied carbon are the emissions associated with the manufacture and transportation of building materials. And in the life cycle of a typical building, depending on its energy sources, the embodied carbon can be the majority of emissions. It's a huge component. Just think, for example, concrete has a huge embodied carbon footprint. It takes a lot of energy to make concrete. It's about 8% of global emissions. So that's just a kind of a random fact, but it's a huge component. So right now, there's no mechanism like we have with PACE funding to align embodied carbon emission reduction and economic goals. Right now, PACE really drives efficiency, especially our serious low carbon product, drives efficiency in the built environment. But we don't have that for embodied carbon. And there's a lot of emerging technologies being used for commercial buildings, like mass timber building and prefabricated buildings, and a lot of work about how to lower the embodied carbon in some of these components, but we don't have those financial mechanisms to drive their adoption to mass market use. So that's something I know is on a topic on a lot of people's minds, and I'm hoping we'll get to a regulatory mechanism that will help that. And then lastly, we'll need to see a real focus on resiliency. So climate change is real and it's happening now and to us. And we can no longer slough off climate change as impacting polar bears or people living across the world. And this past couple of weeks, we've seen California with horrible, devastating impacts from climate change. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing really smoky and hot summers that are harming our ecosystems and threatening human health. It's going to be an enormous undertaking to retrofit every home and facility to be prepared for climate change impacts. There's incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act and but there needs to be much more at the state and local level. And, I actually think that this level of change will require private investment. I don't think it can be borne by the public alone. However, just like nature, capitalism abhors a vacuum, and there's a lot of investment flowing now to innovative carbon reduction and removal technologies and programs. And I'm talking both on the construction side and on, the outreach and the work with the existing built environment. I'm really hopeful that the private sector and the public sector policymakers can develop the means to slow and reduce and reverse the deleterious impacts of man-made climate change on our ecosystems and on us.
That's great to hear the hopefulness there. And it's easy to read the headlines and get hopeless. But, I know you have a daughter, I have 2 kids, and, they are much more aware of climate change and the impacts, than I was growing up. And I think part of that is living here and part of it is truly the impacts. But sometimes we all get a little bit down about it. But then I try to remind them there are people working really hard every day to try to make a difference, whether you're a lawyer or a banker or a financer or an architect or in the timber industry. There's all sorts of people thinking really hard and trying every day incrementally. It might not be really glamorous and splashy all at once, but we're making a difference, and that's hopeful. So I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thanks. Well, I like I said at the beginning, I'm really lucky that I spend my day thinking about climate, which is, personally important to me. But everyone, like you said, has the opportunity to make a positive impact. Even if your job doesn't have the word climate in there, everyone has the ability to make those personal choices, or to advocate for policy that helps make those choices better. And it does feel good to do something, and it is good to be hopeful instead of worried to death about it.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your insights. I'm really excited that we got to get to know you through this podcast, and I'm looking forward to continuing to just learn more about your work and hear about your successes. Please do share those when they come around, or any questions or challenges that come up. It's just really great to make connections through this podcast with people like you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.